Hi Mark, how's it going?
It's fine, Michael. How are you?
I'm having fun reading the reaction to the fact that something wasn't written in the SNP manifesto, which was that there was nothing about a second independence referendum, which Labour and various commentators are saying they haven't denied it, and people are responding to this with they haven't denied that they're going to ban all dogs and cats and so on. But as someone who was involved with the independence referendum and the campaign, but like myself, not a party man, how do you feel about the prospect of another independence referendum, even though the SNP have not mentioned it?
Well, I 100% welcome the idea of another referendum and as soon as possible. One thing that I get a bit cross that the SNP at times seem to be on the back foot a bit with this. I mean, one thing that occurs to me, if there'd been a yes vote on the 18th of September, there is no way their membership would have gone up by whatever it's been, 80,000 people. The reason people have joined them is people like you and I who had the worst day ever on the 19th of September, and a lot of those people took that emotion and joined the SNP as a way of having another go. As Alex Salmond said, to make sure the dream doesn't die, to keep on fighting for it. And I think this attitude of the Westminster parties that we are somehow doing something that's terribly wrong by hoping for the next referendum is ridiculous, quite frankly.
Yeah, I mean, the first time it happened, it was that people voted for a party which had that in their manifesto commitment. Now, if that were to happen again, even though it's not in this manifesto, then basically it's an entirely democratic process. I don't see what the justification would be for stopping it.
No, neither do I. I mean, the attitude seems to be that something has to change for there to be another referendum, and the most often quoted idea on this is if there were to be a vote on Britain's membership of the European Union, and if Scotland voted yes, we'd like to stay, and the rest of the UK said no, we want to leave, that might be a trigger. But as far as I'm concerned, I mean, unless by some miracle Scotland was given the kind of devolved powers as were promised in the infamous vow, then that really, as far as I'm concerned, renders the whole thing null and void. We were told essentially a pack of lies by some very, very desperate people. And almost the minute the vote were in, they walked away from those promises. Now, that's not a good enough reason to say, well, you know what, we want a rerun. I don't know what is.
And also, given that it could be asked for democratically, what do you think is maybe the strategy here? Obviously, Sturgeon does want Scotland to be independent, but do you think it might be wiser to let a discrete amount of time pass before starting the process of another referendum in order to make sure that we're going to win this time? Or do you think it should be better to strike while the iron is hot?
Well, I can have some sympathy if that is indeed the strategy. I just find it a little disappointing because that essentially would be this sort of very, very careful party political approach, and it bears no resemblance to the sort of amazing euphoria that kind of existed around the whole Yes campaign, where such kind of niceties were very much ignored. You know, I kind of look to other, can call them independence movements or different movements, whether it be William Wilberforce in his long and tortuous campaign to end slavery. I mean, vote after vote after vote went against him. He didn't just give up and say, "Oh, that's it then." They've said, "No, I'm not carrying on." When Martin Luther King led the march from Selma to Montgomery and they all got beaten black and blue and didn't get anywhere near to civil rights, he didn't give up. Mandela didn't give up. Mahatma Gandhi didn't give up. And so why are we supposed to be different? And I suppose Nicola has to act a bit, box a bit clever on this, but I just feel that non-aligned voices from Yes can be a bit more bombastic about it and say, I see nothing wrong with there being another vote. After all, we have a general election once every 5 years. No one seems to complain about that.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with asking for more democracy. But what do you think following the process, if the same process were followed, do you think there's a possibility that Westminster would refuse a second referendum?
I think that would be a very, very dangerous game indeed, in that the principle seems to be established now that if a majority of people in Scotland vote for a party that's promising another referendum, it would be pretty sort of heavy-handed London rule to say, well, actually, we've changed our mind on this. You're not having one. Cynically, I rather think with the current oil price that they probably wouldn't mind all that much. They've kind of bled dry what they could get their hands on and maybe aren't just as concerned as they might have been when oil was $120 a barrel.
It's also gone back up, however. But it's always good to finish on a joke. So, do you think that when Salmon said once in a political generation, he was referring to now that he's resigned, Nicola Sturgeon is the next generation?
Well, that could be the case. Yes, who knows what he meant by that? But as they said at the time, and I would certainly say now, this isn't all down to the SNP. This is actually down to the referendum was down to the Yes campaign. And I'd like to think if we're going to have another one, it's down to the people. And politicians' job is to try and mirror what the people want. I was always under the impression that was what democracy was all about. And I'm not aware of any rule that says just because we said no once, that should be it forever and a day, and it's a great crime to even speak about it.
And indeed, the polls suggest that most Scottish people would like to have another referendum within the next 10 years.
Yeah, and quite right too. And maybe it'll be another no vote. It doesn't kind of feel that way with everything that's happened since September, but that's democracy. Sometimes it goes for you, sometimes it doesn't. But I don't think there's any need to be defensive about wanting one.
Thanks very much, Mark.
No problem.
For my terminological inexactitude of the day, it's time to bite the bullet and mention the Daily Telegraph. Once a respectable paper of record, albeit with the manner of a dyspeptic brigadier general, it's deteriorated in recent years into a spiteful, hate-filled rag you wouldn't use for wrapping your chips in case they got covered in drool. Having been taken to the cleaners over Nicola's chat with the French Consul General, it's out for revenge, and the SNP manifesto launch was its big chance. Out came the big hitters. Boris Johnson, who knows the Latin word for everything and the true meaning of nothing, likened the SNP to King Herod, Attila the Hun, and voracious weevils munching the timbers of a church tower. Ian Martin, ostensibly a journalist but actually no more than a puerile Twitter troll, compared the manifesto launch to a Nuremberg rally. But the big lie came in the morning headline. SNP prepared to paralyse armed forces unless Trident is scrapped. It turned out this was all Stuart Hosey's fault for innocuously remarking on Sunday Politics that the SNP would vote against spending they didn't support. Bleeding obvious, you might think, but it inspired the Telegraph to concoct a nightmare scenario of the defence budget being frozen, our boys going unpaid and having to forage in the countryside for nuts and berries, and Vladimir Putin moonwalking unchallenged in Trafalgar Square. The only problem is, even if this ludicrous interpretation were true, the maximum number of SNP MPs would be 59. To paralyse defence spending, 268 of the remaining 591 would have to vote with them, including nearly all of the Tories. A brilliant way to spite Ed Miliband, to be sure, but also electoral suicide, don't you think? That's the Telegraph for you, the journalistic equivalent of barking at the moon.